Hi, my name is Jessica Carson, author, speaker, lecturer, and founder at the Center for Human Creativity. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is the psychology of improvisation. Early in my career, I was put in a very unusual position, which was as a Neuroscience and Psychology Research Fellow at the National Institutes of Health. And I was in a laboratory that was studying the neural basis of creativity, language, flow states, really cool, interesting topics. So I got to put people in brain scanners to see what is happening in their brain during different tasks or activities. For those of you who don't know, this is an fMRI. It is functional magnetic resonance imaging, basically shows you what's happening in different areas of the brain when you're doing different tasks. So what my lab was specifically looking at is what happens in the brain during spontaneous improvisation. In other words, I could read a script off of a piece of paper, or I could sing a song that I made, but I had already come up with. That's not improvisation. Improvisation is truly coming up with creative output on the spot, like musical improvisation, comedy improvisation, rapping. All of those are really great instances of improvisation. We are always spontaneously improvising when we have conversations, when we go on dates, when we're trying to figure out how to deal with the uncertainties of our life. We're constantly engaging in spontaneous creative improvisation. It's just easier to study in the context of a more creative activity like rapping or jazz pianist. So we put rappers and jazz pianists in scanners to see what happened in their brain when they're coming up with novel creative output on the spot. We literally gave them little pianos that they could play in the brain scanner. And then we had different conditions where they're either playing a piece or singing a piece that they already know versus coming up with something original. The results, which we will spend the rest of the time talking about, were so phenomenal that they actually attracted a tremendous amount of media attention, which for academics is very unusual. It was like our Super Bowl. It was covered by tons of different news outlets because it was very exciting and illuminating in terms of revealing the neurological basis of what's happening in our brain when we're creating on the spot. So the findings, and don't be overwhelmed if this doesn't make sense right away, because it will within the next 5 to 10 minutes. During improvisation, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for planning, self-monitoring, becomes less active. And this allows more creative impulses to bubble to the surface. If this makes sense right now, great. If not, hang tight. We're getting there. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or I'll probably just say prefrontal cortex for the rest of the lecture because that's just easier to say. I like to think of it as the grown-up in the front of our brain. It's like the school bus driver that's, deciding if we go left, if we go right, and if we need to slam on the brakes. It does this by suppressing, otherwise known as inhibiting, other brain regions and their functions. So, by inhibiting the impulses that are bubbling up in the rest of our brain, our prefrontal cortex allows us to move towards our goals, to make plans, to self monitor, which is the idea of kind of hovering above myself as I'm giving this presentation to make sure that I don't, pick my nose on camera. That's self-monitoring. And emotional regulation. So the ability to not just constantly fly off the handle because we have an impulse saying I'm angry or I'm sad. So this prefrontal inhibition is extremely important because it helps us move towards our goals and remain a functioning, law-abiding citizen of the world. Right? So our prefrontal cortex is inhibiting impulses from the rest of our brain, which allows us to move towards our goals, to be self-controlled, emotionally regulated, to focus our attention and push away distractions, to be good in social situations, to know when is the right time to say certain things and not say inappropriate things, and obviously good decision making. So I like to think of this as like the Hogwarts Harry Potter part of our brain that's always trying to like do the right thing and make sure no one's left out and no one feels bad and is responsible and diligent. So the prefrontal cortex, when it's inhibiting those responses in a productive way, this allows us to be responsible, to say things like, if I turn down the second drink, I'll feel better in the morning, right? So that's the ability to delay the, oh, I would love to have another drink, but if I have one, I'm not going to feel good in the morning. So I'll say, next time. Or I shouldn't check my phone until I finish this task. Again, that's an example of attention and focus and pushing away distraction. Or if I walk away from a fight now, I'll prevent it from escalating. Again, that self-control so that we can basically stay out of jail and not constantly get canceled. However, this prefrontal inhibition, when it's too intense, when our prefrontal cortex is smacking the hand of everything that we want to do, everything that we want to say, we end up with personalities that are very rigid and perfectionistic. The character that came to mind was Harper from White Lotus, if you've seen it. She was sort of very fussy and rigid and stiff and not very warm, not very like willing to go with the flow. And she, in my mind, even though she's a fictional character, is a good example of someone who is a bit too inhibited. We end up with lower risk tolerance. We're not as spontaneous, willing to go with the flow. We're more socially withdrawn, and we have difficulty expressing emotion. So when we're too inhibited, our inner monologue is something like, if you say the wrong thing, you'll seem stupid. If you make a mistake, you won't get a job. Or if you eat a cookie, you're a horrible person. Prefrontal inhibition is a great thing that keeps us moving towards our goals, but too much can make us just very non-creative. These are people who are, generally speaking, not as dynamic, not as creative. The interesting caveat is that a lack of control, a lack of inhibitory control is also bad. So when the prefrontal cortex is not successful in inhibiting those impulses, what we see are situations like, sorry, I'm not sure where my hands are going, like this, where we see impulsive behavior, poor decision making, emotional dysregulation, difficulties in executive function. This is the precise reason why toddlers, children, preteens, teenagers struggle with regulating their emotions and making good decisions, because their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet. That doesn't fully develop until later on in our 20s. And so when we don't have that inhibitory control, we end up in situations like we become criminals or slackers, or we get canceled, or, we are naughty toddlers. So I made this, forgive the, cartoonish nature of this, but I know the concept can be a little bit confusing. So too much inhibition makes you stiff, rigid, perfectionistic. Too little inhibition, impulsive, reckless, deviant. So most of the time in an ideal state, we're kind of hanging out somewhere in the middle. We're not too inhibited. There's not too little inhibition, but we're kind of in that just right zone. That's not necessarily where you want to be if you need to be highly creative. Because when we need to be highly creative, we need those emotions, those insights, those impulses, those desires, those more primitive, symbolic, emotional material that exists in the rest of our brain, not in our prefrontal cortex, to contribute to the creative process. And so when we have too much inhibition, we ultimately smush down a lot of those original ideas, and we end up not being very creative, not having the insights and the ideas necessary for creative work. So what this is saying is that when we're in situations, whether for work or for a hobby or on a date, where we need to be more creative, when we need to be more just letting the ideas flow, being inhibited can be a real problem. And this, by the way, is why people enjoy having a glass of wine when they're in situations that they might otherwise be inhibited, like a first date, because wine does the same thing to the prefrontal cortex that we see with the rappers and the jazz pianists and the brain scanners, where it's silencing that inhibition, right? It's allowing more of the impulses to bubble up to the surface, and that self-monitoring critic that's saying, you're doing it wrong, you're saying it wrong, you're being awkward, they don't like you, why are they looking at that other person, quiets that voice and allows more of that authentic creative conversation to come to the surface, with the obvious caveat that that kind of dissipates after like a glass or so of wine, and then it's a point of diminishing returns. So we have these creative impulses bubbling through our brain all the time. These are some other parts of our brain that are responsible for participating in the creative process. This is not a complete list, this is a partial list, but we have the default mode network, which is active in daydreaming. The limbic system, which is responsible for emotions and memory. The amygdala is part of the limbic system. You might have heard of the amygdala. Temporal lobes are responsible for language and speech, which is obviously a big part of many creative processes. Parietal lobes are responsible for spatial processing and attention. So we have all of these other areas of our brain that are constantly contributing to our creative process, but have this gatekeeper of our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that they need to get the clearance to get past in order to come out in the form of creative ideas. So when our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex gives us the okay, says, okay, that's not going to lead to our imminent death or embarrassment, we get creative output in the form of music and comedy and et cetera, et cetera. The challenge is that when you have too much inhibition from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you get very little creative, sorry, I need to learn my sides, very little creative output coming out. So again, if you are someone or you know someone who's struggling with creative output, it may be because there's too much inhibition coming from this part of your brain that's blocking the creative impulses from coming out. So what the research found in these rappers and jazz pianists is that they have this task-specific or situation-specific loosening of inhibition. I love this quote from the main researcher on the project. Like an experienced parent who knows when to lay down the law and when to look away, these shifts in brain function may facilitate the free expression of thoughts and words without the usual neural constraints. In other words, these rappers and jazz pianists aren't running around all the time in this wildly disinhibited state because they would probably be in jail or would not be known or successful because they would be canceled. When they are engaging in this activity, when the writer's sitting down to write, when the comedian gets on stage, when Eminem gets up in front of the club, there's this specific loosening of inhibition that happens for the goal of coming up with the creative output. So we can also call this selective disinhibition. So when there's a productive ability to inhibit our brain's disciplinarian, to focus less on self-control and more on creating in the moment, we see tremendous creative and entrepreneurial potential. I know that we all know some creatives, some entrepreneurs, maybe we are that creative or are that entrepreneur who have this remarkable ability to just kind of like let it flow. They just say the idea. They always have that funny or witty remark. They always just have that really clever or brilliant idea at the tip of their brain waiting to spill out. And these are people who, generally speaking, are able to disinhibit more so that they can be more creative, again, when appropriate. And oftentimes when you get these personalities, you're going to have slips a lot. You know, if you're more loose, you're more loose. And so sometimes you may put your foot in your mouth. And that's kind of part of the risk of a creative personality. I think it's a risk that's well worth it. Unfortunately, society is also very quick to cancel. So improv pros, whether you're Chris Rock or you're Kristen Wiig or you're Drake, or you are, sorry, I'm blanking on what it's called. Slam poetry, sorry. These people whose brains are just wired for improv because they have either taught themselves or are naturally that way, have the ability to become selectively disinhibited. This allows them to be functioning members of society, but also highly creative. So this all leads us to the question, what can we try, us mere mortals, the everyday creators, to loosen up a bit, loosen up that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex inhibition so that we're able to access more of those genuinely creative ideas and insights. So in order to understand this, we first have to explore what blocks us from successful improvisation. Judgment, either self-judgment or judgment from others, criticism from ourselves or others, anxiety, stress, situations that are very serious or buttoned up or professional, time pressure, feel like we're being watched. These are all things that can get our prefrontal cortex on high alert to be a very good girl or boy, right? And to not let the more creative ideas come. So when we're in situations that, sorry, I have a hair. When we're in situations where we feel like we're being judged or we're not accepted or someone's looking over our shoulder, or it's just a very cold or clinical or buttoned up environment, we are going to struggle more with improv. So the first part of being better at improv is realizing what blocks it. Accordingly, what unlocks it is the opposite. So acceptance, getting productive feedback, but afterwards, what we don't want to do for improv is, when someone's in the middle of sharing something or doing something or creating something, laying on our feedback and opinions in the middle of it, that's a surefire way to cut the creativity off. More relaxedness, more playfulness, more spaciousness, all of these different qualities allow us to really just flow with it, to not feel as inhibited. And that's why we feel like we can be ourselves around people who are more open and playful. So this begs us to ask ourselves, what can we do in our workspace, whether we are entrepreneurs or we work in an office, if we're really setting up our work environments for improvisational creativity? So here are some questions you might want to ask yourself, you might want to ask your colleagues in terms of whether or not these are helpful or harmful for creative improvisation. Things like open office layouts may be helpful. For others, they may encourage a feeling of being watched, of not having the spaciousness or the privacy to really get loose and create. Mandatory in office time. We all have environments in which we are comfortable or most comfortable creating, most comfortable being ourselves. I would say very few of us would say we are most comfortable being ourselves in a corporate office. So I'm not saying we should never go into an office or you can't be creative in an office. What I'm saying is if you have a group of highly creative people who are communicating that they can only really get into that improvisational state when they're in their own environment, that could be a real, really important factor to consider. Project management processes. Again, I realize that a lot of these are just necessary evils of running a scaled business, but sometimes the way that project management processes are conducted are not always conducive to that improvisational creativity. There's more intensity, timelines, seriousness, structure, constraints, and creativity does love constraints, but improvisation does need a bit more of that spaciousness. Employee review processes, again, necessary evil, but maybe thinking about the way the feedback is delivered, what types of success metrics are actually measured. And finally, a buttoned up culture. If you're working in a very pristine, shiny shoed law office, it may not be the most conducive to spontaneous improvisation. So these are all just factors to weigh in your own workplace in terms of what you can do to facilitate that. So in terms of specific activities and techniques that each of us can do to be better at improv, I would say this largely depends on where you feel like you're most inhibited. For some of us, that inhibition may be more global. We may feel like we're inhibited in voice, we're inhibited in mind, and we're inhibited in body. But for some people, they may feel like maybe they're feel really awkward and uncomfortable in their body, but they have no problem speaking their mind, or they have tremendously creative ideas, but they need to figure out how to use their voice. Whatever the combination is, here are some recommendations for what you can do. For people who are more inhibited in voice, they feel like they're more quiet, they're more constrained, they're not as comfortable using their voice, speaking their ideas, sharing their ideas, doing things like improv comedy workshops. Wow. I did a 12-week improv intensive, and it will teach you one thing really fast, which is that if you're worried about seeming stupid, you will seem more stupid. So you learn really quickly that inhibition and self-monitoring and self-criticism are going to make you fail way harder than when you are not leaning on those inhibitory processes as much. So I highly, highly recommend this to pretty much anyone who wants to be more creative. Public speaking clubs also, again, helpful with coming up with ideas, thoughts, language on the spot, and language lessons. Language lessons, learning another language will teach us really quickly that the more that we are thinking versus flowing with it, the harder that it's going to be. If you're feeling like you're more inhibited in mind, like you're stuck, you're uninspired, you have writer's block or a creator's block, engaging in non-performative creative practices. So I give the examples of cooking and watercoloring. For me, watercoloring is so important because it's something that I'm not good at. I wasn't trained in. I don't pretend to be good at it, but it's something that I enjoy. And it's a creative process that allows me to really release that I need to be good, I need to be perfect, I need to do this right, and just go with the flow. And that kind of improvisational creativity for me, where my ego, my self-worth isn't attached, is so incredibly freeing in terms of then accessing other areas of my creativity. Also, research has found that mindfulness meditation, specifically practices that are more around watching, accepting, observing your thoughts, finding more peace and acceptance within yourself, can be great in terms of loosening that inhibitory control. And then dance classes, not in a, very rigid, I would not recommend taking point ballet classes to become less inhibited, because actually that requires quite a bit of inhibition. But doing something like a hip hop class or a swing dance class or partner dancing can be a really fun way to just loosen it up and let it out. Nonlinear yoga, what I mean by that is not the more kind of inhibited, rule structured, like Ashtanga type practices, but more of the big movement, flowy. A lot of forms of yoga are more improvisational. If you're curious, because I am a yogi, I highly recommend checking out prana yoga and strala yoga for more disinhibited yoga. And finally, freestyle movement, whatever that means for you, shaking, dancing, moving, wiggling, whatever it is that makes you feel less inhibited in your body. These are all really, really nice ways to start training our brain to take the whole creative act a bit less seriously. Because the truth is, when we start taking it less seriously, we become a lot better at it. So that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please, please, please reach out to me. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I do coaching, I do workshops, I do keynotes. You can find that all on my website, as well as lots of fun blog posts on all of these different topics. Give us a follow on Instagram, subscribe to our channel, and I hope to see you again soon.